The blood on Ezekiel Thorne's hands wasn't his own, but he wished it was. At 30 years old, a man who'd seen the horrors of war and the bite of a Montana winter, he was about to be beaten by a patch of dirt in a relentless sun. He stood beside his horse, Duchess, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. 3 days without water, 2 without food, 1 without hope. Overhead, a buzzard circled, a black speck against a pale, unforgiving sky. It was patient. It knew his time was running out. He'd survived gunfights, blizzards, and the kind of loneliness that eats a man from the inside out. But this Arizona desert between Tucson and nowhere, this was a different kind of monster. It didn't attack you. It just waited for you to die. The silence was so complete it was like a sound itself. The whisper of wind over sand, the dry rasp of his own breathing. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Hoofbeats, steady, unhurried, coming closer. His hand, raw and cracked, fell to the Colt at his hip. It was pure instinct, the muscle memory of a man who knew hesitation was a death sentence. He squinted, his eyes burning, as a figure crested the shimmering ridgeline. And he froze, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. It was a woman, riding bareback on a paint horse, her black hair flowing behind her like a river of ink. Her skin was the color of rich earth, and she moved with her horse like they were one creature. Apache, his mind screamed. An Apache warrior, alone, riding straight for him. Every story he'd ever heard, every warning from every settlement, told him to draw his weapon. The Apache were ghosts, leaving fire and death in their wake. They were the reason settlers checked their locks twice and slept with rifles by their beds. But something held his hand. Maybe it was the way she sat her horse, not a raider's aggressive posture, but something calm, something measured. Or maybe it was the simple fact that she was alone. No war party would send a single rider. Or maybe, just maybe, he was too damn tired to die fighting. She pulled her horse to a halt about 20 yards out. Smart, just beyond pistol range. Her eyes, dark and sharp, took him in. She saw the dust caked on his clothes, the exhaustion in his horse, the slight tremor in his hand from dehydration. She saw a man at his end. For what felt like an eternity, they just stared at each other across the heat haze. Two ghosts in a land that created them. Then she spoke. Her voice was clear, with a strange accent he couldn't quite place. "You are lost, white man." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Ezekiel's throat felt like sandpaper. He forced a word out, a dry croak. Not lost, just taking the scenic route. A flicker of something, amusement maybe, touched her lips. The scenic route to the buzzard's belly. He couldn't help it. A dry, hacking laugh escaped him. "You got a better suggestion." She watched him for another long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nudged her horse forward, closing the distance between them. He could see the intricate beadwork on her deerskin dress now, a single silver bracelet on her wrist. Her eyes seemed to hold the entire desert in their depths. "There is water," she said, her voice low. "Half a day's ride north. A hidden spring." Ezekiel stared at her, certain the sun had finally cooked his brain. "And why would you tell me that?" Her answer was cold and practical. "Because dead men make poor traveling companions." He blinked. "Traveling companions?" She gestured with her chin to the vast empty horizon. "I am going to California, to the gold fields. They say a man's work is worth more than his blood there." The idea was so absurd, so completely out of left field, that Ezekiel felt another broken laugh bubble up. An Apache woman, traveling alone to California? It was suicide. "Not Apache," she corrected him, her voice suddenly sharp. "Chiricahua, and my name is Ayana." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And I won't be alone if you have enough sense to accept help when it's offered." Ezekiel looked from his dying horse to this impossible woman who had appeared like an angel or a devil. He couldn't decide which. Nothing about this made sense. Chiricahua, Apache, it was all the same to the men whose homesteads were burning. They were enemies. He should be aiming his Colt, not considering her offer. But his canteen was empty. His horse was swaying on her feet, and that buzzard was still circling overhead. Logic was a luxury for men who weren't dying of thirst. Ezekiel, he rasped. Ezekiel Thorne. Well, Ezekiel Thorne, she said, her tone a clear challenge. Do you want to live to see another sunrise? Or shall I leave you here to discuss philosophy with the buzzards? He looked up at the circling scavenger, then back at her. Her face was a mask of stoicism, but her eyes were waiting. In all his 30 years of wandering and fighting, he had never faced a choice so simple, yet so profound. I reckon I prefer the sunrise, he said finally. Ayana nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. Then we ride north. But understand this, white man. I am not your guide. I am not your servant, and I am not your woman. We travel together for survival, nothing more. The way she said nothing more felt like a warning shot across his bow. There were layers to this woman, depths he couldn't begin to fathom. But he was in no position to argue. He dragged himself into Duchess's saddle, the worn leather groaning in protest. As they rode north, with Ayana setting a steady, ground-eating pace, Ezekiel couldn't shake a strange feeling. She hadn't just appeared out of nowhere. It felt intentional. It felt like she hadn't just found him. It felt like she had been looking for him. They rode in a tense silence, the only sounds the plodding of hooves and the whisper of the wind. Ayana moved with an unnerving confidence, as if the desert wasn't a sprawling death trap, but her own backyard. Ezekiel, meanwhile, focused every ounce of his remaining energy on just staying upright. As they climbed into the foothills, the landscape began to shift. The oppressive flatness gave way to rolling hills dotted with stubborn scrub oak. The air, impossibly, grew a fraction cooler. The world was slowly coming back to life. Or maybe he was. They paused in the shade of a massive boulder that looked like a giant's discarded plaything. You have been in Arizona long? Ayana asked, her eyes scanning the horizon, always watching. 3 years, Ezekiel answered, his voice still rough. Came out after the war. Which side? 3rd Cavalry, Union. She nodded slowly, as if that explained something fundamental about him. You have the look of a soldier. Even half dead, you sit your horse like a man used to discipline. He wasn't sure if it was a compliment or just an observation. He found himself studying her profile against the harsh light. She couldn't be more than 20, but her eyes held a weariness that didn't belong on a young woman's face. What about you? He asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. How does a Chiricahua woman end up speaking English better than most folks in Tucson? A muscle in her jaw tightened, a barely perceptible flicker of emotion. My father was white, a trapper. He taught me his language. She paused. Then he left. The words were delivered without a hint of self-pity, which somehow made them cut deeper. He saw a flash of a story there, a wound hastily covered over. I'm sorry, he mumbled, feeling clumsy. Do not pity me, Ezekiel Thorne, she said, her voice like flint. Pity is a luxury. I learned early that a woman of mixed blood belongs to no one. So I belong to myself. Her strength was like a physical presence. It was intimidating, and for reasons he couldn't explain, deeply compelling. They remounted and pushed on. As the sun began its slow dip toward the western mountains, she led him into a narrow canyon he would have ridden right past. And there it was. Tucked between 2 sheer rock faces was a pool of water so clear and cool, it looked like a mirage. A hidden spring. Ezekiel practically fell out of his saddle, stumbling to the water's edge and plunging his face into it. It was the sweetest thing he'd ever tasted. It was life itself. As Duchess and her paint horse drank their fill, Ezekiel watched Ayana. She moved with a quiet efficiency, refilling their canteens, checking the perimeter. She wasn't just surviving out here. She was at home. But something about the spring bothered him. It was hidden, yes, but not impossible to find. He could see faint tracks near the water's edge. Deer, coyote, but also horseshoes. Not fresh, but not ancient either. This place wasn't some long-lost secret known only to her grandmother. Other people knew about it. Other riders. So why had she lied? Or if not lied, why had she embellished the truth? We make camp here, she announced as darkness began to pool in the canyon. Travel at dawn. They built a small, smokeless fire and shared what little food they had. a bit of jerky, some hardtack. It tasted like a king's feast. The firelight danced on her face, softening the hard lines he'd seen in the daylight. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, something that had nothing to do with dehydration. He'd known women, of course, quick transactional encounters in dusty towns and army camps. But this was different. Sitting across the flames from this woman who had saved his life, he felt a pull, a dangerous current of curiosity and something more. "Why California?" he asked, needing to fill the silence. "Freedom," she answered simply. "A place where a person's worth is measured by their work, not their skin." "You really believe a place like that exists?" "I believe enough to risk my life for the chance." She met his gaze across the flickering flames, and her eyes were piercing. "What about you, Ezekiel Thorne? What is a former cavalry soldier doing wandering the desert, so far from any road he nearly dies?" The question landed like a punch. How could he explain the gnawing restlessness that had haunted him since the war? The feeling of being a ghost in his own life, always moving, never arriving. "I guess I'm still looking for something," he admitted, the words tasting strange and true in his mouth. "And what is that?" she pressed, her voice soft but insistent. He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. A distant coyote howled its lonely song to the stars. "A reason," he said finally, the words surprising even himself. "A reason to stop moving." Ayana nodded slowly, a deep and unnerving understanding in her eyes. "Perhaps we are not so different, you and I." They fell into a comfortable silence after that, but Ezekiel's mind was racing. Her story about her father, her quest for freedom in California, the hidden spring, it all felt a little too neat, a little too clean. It was a good story, a perfect story. And out here in a world of dust and death, perfect things were usually lies. He rolled himself in his blanket on the far side of the dying embers, but sleep wouldn't come. He was acutely aware of her, just a few yards away. The soft sound of her breathing was a steady rhythm in the vast silence of the desert night. There was a tension in the air, a live wire running between them. It was more than just man and woman. It was predator and prey, rescuer and rescued. But he was starting to wonder, which was which? When he finally drifted off, his dreams were of dark eyes that held secrets, and a voice that spoke of hidden springs that weren't quite hidden at all. What was she really doing out here, all alone? The thought followed him into the dawn. They broke camp in the gray pre-dawn light, moving with the shared urgency of people who knew the sun was their enemy. As they rode west, the land continued to soften, the harsh desert slowly surrendering to hills covered in oak and pine. It was a beautiful, rugged country, but Ezekiel couldn't appreciate it. His mind was a knot of suspicion. Every time he glanced at Ayana, she seemed perfectly composed, her eyes on the horizon. But he started noticing things, small things. The way her hand would occasionally drift down, not to a pistol, but to a small beaded pouch on her belt. The way her gaze would linger on the tops of ridges, as if she wasn't just watching for danger, but waiting for a signal. And her horse. It was a fine animal, strong and sure-footed, but it was too well fed for a horse that had supposedly been traveling alone across the wastes. Duchess was gaunt, her ribs showing. Ayana's paint looked like it had been eating from a grain bucket just yesterday. By midday, they struck a stagecoach road, a dusty ribbon winding through the mountains. The sight of wheel ruts was a strange comfort. "This road will lead to the next town," Ayana said. "We can get supplies." "What town?" Ezekiel asked. "Harmony Creek," she replied without hesitation. She knew the name of the town. She knew this road. She wasn't just wandering west, hoping for the best. She had a destination, a plan, and he was, for some reason he couldn't yet fathom, a part of it. "Tell me about the war," she said suddenly, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. The question was jarring. "What do you want to know?" "What did it teach you?" He thought for a moment, the memories a bitter taste in his mouth. "It taught me that good men can do terrible things, and that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about what you do when you are." He paused, the words heavy. "And it taught me that sometimes the reasons you start fighting aren't the reasons you keep fighting." "My people have been fighting for generations," she said, her voice low and hard. We understand the cost. You've seen it yourself. The fighting? Her eyes went distant, dark with a memory he couldn't see. I have seen my village burn. I have seen what happens when one people decides another has no right to exist. The raw pain in her voice was like a physical blow. Suddenly he felt ashamed. His war, for all its horror, was a thing he had chosen to join. Hers was a thing she had been born into. They rode on, the silence between them thick with unspoken history. Soon they saw smoke curling up from a valley below, a small settlement nestled by a river. Harmony Creek, Ayanna said, her voice tight. She was reading a weathered sign at the edge of town. Population 400. But as they rode down the main street, a wide, dusty avenue lined with raw timber buildings, Ezekiel felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. The name was a lie. There was no harmony here. The looks they got were instant and hostile. A white man and an Indian woman riding together. It was more than unusual. It was a provocation. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. A low murmur followed them like a swarm of angry bees. This town was a powder keg, and they were the lit match. Maybe we should split up, he suggested in a low voice. Meet on the other side. Ayanna's response was to straighten her back, lifting her chin in a gesture of pure defiance. I am not ashamed to be seen with you, Ezekiel Thorne. Are you ashamed to be seen with me? Before he could answer, a man stepped out from a storefront, blocking their path. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver star pinned to his vest. His eyes were the color of a faded sky, and they missed nothing. They swept over Ezekiel, then lingered on Ayanna with an expression that made Ezekiel's hand twitch toward his Colt. Hold up there, the man called out, his voice a calm, authoritative drawl. Sheriff Marcus Wade, I'll need a word. Ezekiel felt Ayanna go perfectly still beside him. Her face was a blank mask, but he could feel the tension radiating off her like heat from a forge. This was it. This was the moment everything was about to change. The sheriff wasn't just enforcing the law. He was looking at Ayanna like he was looking at a ghost. Sheriff Wade walked toward them with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who owned the ground he stood on. His pale eyes flickered between Ezekiel and Ayanna, sizing them up, calculating. Just passing through, Ezekiel said, his voice flat, looking to resupply. West, you say? Wade's gaze was fixed on Ayanna now. Lot of trouble on the western roads. Apache raids, bandits. He said the word Apache with a pointed emphasis, a casual cruelty meant to wound. Ezekiel felt his own anger begin to simmer. He didn't like this man, not one bit. But it was Ayanna who spoke, her voice steady and cold as creek water. Is there a law against traveling in your town, Sheriff? Wade smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. No law against it, miss. Just, unusual. Folks might get the wrong idea about your arrangements. The insinuation hung in the dusty air. A small crowd was gathering now, drawn by the promise of a confrontation. Storekeepers and loafers, their faces a mixture of curiosity and open hostility. Sheriff, Ezekiel said, his voice dropping low, a clear warning. We're not looking for trouble. Trouble has a way of finding folks, Wade replied, stepping closer to Ayanna's horse, forcing her to look down at him. You wouldn't happen to know anything about the raid on the Murphy Ranch last week, would you? 3 dead. Apache work by the look of it. Ayanna's face was stone. I know nothing of any raid. Of course not. Wade's smile widened. But you can understand if folks are a bit nervous. That was it. Ezekiel swung down from his saddle, his boots hitting the street with a solid thud. He was now standing less than an arm's length from the sheriff. He saw Wade's hand drop toward his gun. The lady saved my life in the desert, Ezekiel said, his voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. I'll vouch for her. If you've got a problem with her, you've got a problem with me. The crowd held its breath. Wade looked him up and down. And who might you be? Ezekiel Thorne, 3rd United States Cavalry. Something shifted in the sheriff's eyes, a flicker of recalculation. He was used to intimidating drifters and sodbusters, not disciplined soldiers. I appreciate your service, Mr. Thorne, Wade said, his tone still mocking, but this here is civilian business, and I'm the law. The lady hasn't broken any laws, Ezekiel countered. So unless you plan on arresting us, we'll be on our way. The tension was a physical thing, a stretched wire about to snap. Wade glanced at the watching crowd, then back at Ezekiel. He seemed to make a decision. All right then, he said, stepping back. Conduct your business, but any trouble, and I'll hold you both responsible. He tipped his hat in a gesture that was pure insult, then turned and walked away. The crowd began to drift apart, but the whispers and stares remained. They had been marked. Thank you, Ayanna said softly as they moved toward the general store. For what? For standing with me. A crack appeared in her stoic facade, a glimpse of vulnerability. It would have been easier not to. We're traveling together, he said. That means something. The look she gave him was intense, filled with a meaning he couldn't decipher. Yes, she said, it means something. They bought their supplies from a nervous, sweating store owner who overcharged them by double. Ezekiel paid without a word. Arguing would only make things worse. As they loaded the saddlebags, Ayanna spoke, her voice urgent. We cannot stay here tonight. Ezekiel looked around. Hostile eyes watched from every doorway. Wade had poisoned the well. Agreed, he said. We can make 10 more miles before dark. They mounted up and rode out of town, the silence of the street pressing in on them. They were almost clear, the last buildings falling away behind them, and then he heard it, the sound that every soldier, every man who has ever been hunted, dreads. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming up fast from behind. He glanced over his shoulder. 4 riders, spurring their horses hard, faces grim with intent. They weren't lawmen. They were a lynch mob. Ride! He yelled at Ayanna, but she was already moving. They kicked their horses into a desperate gallop, the town's parting shots echoing behind them. Shouts and curses followed them down the dusty road. Their pursuers were on fresher horses, and they were gaining. The distance was closing with terrifying speed. This wasn't just a random act of prejudice. This was planned. Wade hadn't just warned them. He'd sicked his dogs on them. This way, Ayanna shouted, pointing to a narrow, rocky trail that snaked up into the hills. They veered off the road just as the first bullets started to fly. The sharp crack of rifles echoed in the air, and Ezekiel heard the whine of lead passing far too close. They scrambled up the treacherous path, their horses slipping on the loose shale. Duchess, still weak, stumbled badly. Ezekiel barely kept his seat. The mare couldn't keep this pace. They were running out of time and out of trail. Up there, Ayanna yelled, gesturing toward a jagged outcrop of boulders that formed a natural fortress. We make our stand. They reached the rocks just as their horses began to falter, their sides heaving. Ezekiel grabbed his rifle from its scabbard, diving behind a slab of granite that offered good cover. Ayanna was right beside him, a Winchester rifle appearing in her hands as if by magic. She handled it with a familiarity that sent a shiver down his spine. This was not the first gunfight she'd been in. The 4 riders thundered around a bend below them. Ezekiel recognized 2 of them from the crowd in town. That's far enough, he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls. Turn back now. The leader, a big man with a greasy beard, just laughed. A cruel, ugly sound. We're just getting started, soldier boy. We're going to teach your squaw a lesson. The slur was a lit fuse. He saw Ayanna's knuckles go white on her rifle stock. Last warning, Ezekiel shouted. Go to hell, the man yelled back, raising his rifle. Ezekiel's shot was first. The crack of his rifle split the air, and the bearded man was flung from his saddle, clutching a shattered shoulder. Chaos erupted. The other 3 riders scattered for cover, firing wildly. Ayanna's Winchester answered, barking twice. A man screamed as her bullet found its mark. The narrow canyon became a cauldron of noise and ricocheting lead. But these townsmen were amateurs. They were fueled by hate and whiskey, not skill. They were used to intimidating, not fighting back against trained shooters. Their fire was inaccurate, panicked. After 10 minutes of furious exchange, it was over. The remaining 2 men dragged their wounded comrades and retreated back down the trail, their enthusiasm for a fight thoroughly extinguished. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in Ezekiel's ears and the heavy sound of his own breathing. His hands were shaking from the adrenaline. Are you hurt? He asked, turning to Ayanna. She shook her head, but her face was pale. The mask was gone. He could see the shock, the fear, and something else. A deep, profound sadness. "We cannot go back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No," he agreed. "We can't." They were fugitives now, marked men, or a marked man and a marked woman. The line had been crossed back in Harmony Creek, and there was no going back. They collected their weary horses and pushed deeper into the mountains, leaving the town and its venom behind them. That night they made a cold camp in a grove of pines, not daring to risk a fire. The reality of their situation settled in. They were being hunted. "It's not your fault," Ezekiel said into the darkness. He heard her shift beside him. "Isn't it? If you had been traveling alone, you'd just be another drifter. No one would have bothered you." "If I'd been traveling alone," he countered, "I'd be dead in the desert." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but you would not be a wanted man." The truth of her words was a cold weight between them. By defending her, he had made her enemies his own. He had chosen a side. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. The question hit him with the force of a physical blow. Did he regret it? The smart answer was yes. The safe answer was yes. This woman had brought him nothing but violence and danger. His life had been simple before. Just him, his horse, and the endless horizon. Now he was running from a posse with a woman he barely knew, a woman full of secrets and contradictions. But as he looked at her silhouette in the faint starlight, at the proud, defiant set of her shoulders, he found an answer he didn't expect. "No," he said, and the word was solid, absolute. "I don't regret it." He felt more than saw her turn toward him in the darkness. He couldn't see her expression, but he felt the shift in the air, the release of some tightly held tension. He reached out, not even thinking, and his hand found hers. Her skin was cool, her fingers strong. She didn't pull away. For a long moment, they just stayed like that. Two solitary figures connected in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Then she squeezed his hand. Once, a silent acknowledgement, an agreement. But as he lay there trying to find sleep, a new, more disturbing thought began to form in his mind. The attack had been too fast, too organized. Wade had confronted them, and minutes later, a posse was riding them down. It felt less like a spontaneous act of mob justice and more like a trap. A trap that had been set long before they ever rode into Harmony Creek. And if it was a trap, who was the bait? Him or her? The uneasy alliance forged in the dark mountains grew stronger with every mile they put between themselves and Harmony Creek. They traveled hard and fast, speaking little, each lost in their own thoughts. But a new dynamic had taken root. They were no longer just two people surviving together. They were partners. They watched each other's backs, shared the last of their food without a word, and moved with a synchronized rhythm born of shared danger. Ezekiel found himself watching her constantly. He saw the way she read the land, the subtle shifts in terrain, the tracks of animals, the direction of the wind. She was a part of this wilderness in a way he, for all his years out west, would never be. But the questions still gnawed at him. The perfectly timed attack, her convenient appearance in the desert, the too perfect story. One evening, as they rested their horses by a stream, he decided he couldn't carry the silence any longer. "That spring," he began, his voice casual, "the one where you found me. You said your grandmother showed it to you." She was sharpening a small knife on a whetstone, her movements fluid and precise. She didn't look up. "She did. There were horseshoe tracks there, not just yours." She paused, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel stopping. She finally lifted her head, and her dark eyes met his. There was no surprise in them, no defensiveness, just a quiet waiting. "It is not as secret as it once was," she said simply. "And Harmony Creek," he pushed on, feeling like he was walking on thin ice. "You knew its name. You knew the road. You weren't just wandering, were you, Ayana? You were heading there specifically." She set the knife and stone down carefully. "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air. All his suspicions, all the little inconsistencies, solidified into a hard, undeniable truth. She had been lying to him, or at least not telling him the whole truth. "Why?" he asked, his voice tight. Why lie to me? I did not lie, she countered, her voice calm. I simply did not tell you everything. A woman traveling alone learns that the truth is a dangerous currency. You do not spend it all at once. What were you going to Harmony Creek for? She looked away, toward the setting sun that was painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple. I was looking for someone. Sheriff Wade, Ezekiel said. It wasn't a question. The way they had looked at each other, the instant, crackling tension between them. It was more than just lawman and Indian. It was personal. Ayanna nodded, a barely perceptible movement. Why? Ezekiel pressed. What is he to you? She was silent for a long time, and he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of all its hardness, leaving only a raw, aching vulnerability. He is the trapper, she said softly. The white man who came to my village all those years ago. The one who taught me his language. The breath caught in Ezekiel's throat. He is my father. The revelation hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. Sheriff Marcus Wade. The cruel, arrogant lawman was her father. The man who had abandoned her and her mother. The man who had looked at her with such contempt on that dusty street. Does he know? Ezekiel asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. I do not think he recognized me, she said, her gaze distant. I was a child when he left, but I recognized him. I have carried his face in my memory my entire life. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Her journey wasn't about finding freedom in California. It was about finding him. This was a pilgrimage of vengeance, or of reckoning. What were you going to do? He asked. Confront him? A bitter smile touched her lips. I don't know. For years I imagined it. Sometimes I would scream at him. Sometimes I would spit in his face. Sometimes I just wanted him to look at me, to see me. Her voice broke on the last words. The depth of her pain was staggering. All her strength, her fierce independence, was a shield built around this single gaping wound. The raid, Ezekiel said, another piece falling into place. The one on the Murphy Ranch. Wade brought it up immediately. He tried to pin it on you. He has always used my people as his excuse, she said, her voice hardening again, the shield sliding back into place. When settlers get restless, when livestock goes missing, when his own crimes need a shadow to hide in, he blames the Apache. It is the oldest and easiest lie in this territory. A cold realization washed over Ezekiel. His own crimes? What are you talking about? Ayanna looked at him, her eyes burning with a fire that had been banked for years. The Murphy Ranch. It has the best water rights in that valley. Old man Murphy refused to sell to Wade 3 times. A week later, his ranch is attacked by Apache, and he and his family are dead. You think Wade was behind it? I know it, she said with chilling certainty. He runs that town like his own private kingdom. He uses fear to control the people, and masked riders to eliminate anyone who stands in his way. He's not just a sheriff, he's a land baron, building an empire on stolen ground and unmarked graves. Ezekiel stared at her, his mind reeling. They hadn't just stumbled into a racist town. They had stumbled into the heart of a conspiracy, run by the one man who was supposed to uphold the law. The posse that chased them hadn't been a lynch mob. They were Wade's private army, sent to silence the one person who could expose him, his daughter. So your appearance in the desert, he began, was not a coincidence, she finished for him. I knew you were out there. I have been tracking you for a week. Ezekiel felt a jolt, a profound sense of dislocation. His entire reality for the past several days had been a carefully constructed stage. Tracking me? Why me? Because of who you are, Ezekiel Thorne, she said, her gaze intense. Former 3rd Cavalry, a man with a reputation. I read the Army dispatches. I listened to the stories in the saloons. You are not a drifter. You are a man who knows how to fight, a man who stands his ground. She took a breath. I needed a partner, an ally. I could not face Wade in his town alone. I needed a soldier. He was not her rescue. He was her weapon. He had been chosen, recruited, manipulated from the very beginning. The dying of thirst, the miraculous rescue. All of it, a calculated play to earn his trust and secure his loyalty. A hot surge of anger rose in him. He had been used. He stood up, pacing back and forth, the betrayal of bitter acid in his gut. So you let me nearly die out there, just to see if I was worth saving? No, she said, standing to face him, her eyes pleading. You were already in the desert. Your horse was already failing. I found you because you were already in trouble. I simply used the opportunity that presented itself. An opportunity, he repeated, the word sharp. You played me, Ayanna. I saved you, Ezekiel, she shot back, her voice ringing with passion. Whatever my reasons, the truth is you would be dead without me, and I would have been killed or worse leaving Harmony Creek without you. We needed each other. We still do. He stopped, turning to face her. The anger was still there, but it was being tempered by a grudging respect. It was a hell of a plan. Devious, risky, but brilliant. And she was right. They had saved each other. What now? He asked, the question heavy with the weight of their new reality. We can't go back. Wade will have men watching every road. We will not use the roads, she said, a new harder edge to her voice. And we are not running anymore. We are going back to Harmony Creek. Ezekiel stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. Go back. They'll shoot us on sight. They will be expecting us to run west, she explained, her mind already working, plotting. They will not be expecting us to circle back through the mountains. We will not go back to fight them. Not yet. We will go back to hunt them, to watch, to learn, and to find proof of what Wade did to the Murphys. It was insane. It was suicide, walking back into the lion's den. But as he looked at the fierce determination in her eyes, the righteous fire burning there, he knew he didn't have a choice. His own aimless wandering was over. Ayanna had given him what he'd been looking for all along, a reason to stop moving, a reason to fight. All right, he said, the words sealing their fate. We go back, but we do this my way, soldier's way. We're not just going to find proof. We're going to dismantle his entire operation. We're going to take his town away from him. A slow smile spread across Ayanna's face, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her, lighting her up from the inside. I was hoping you would say that, soldier. In that moment, everything shifted. The lies, the manipulation, it all burned away in the heat of their shared purpose. They were no longer rescuer and rescued. They were partners in a war against a king in a dusty, forgotten town. And the war had just begun. They moved through the mountains like ghosts. Ayanna's knowledge of the terrain was a weapon in itself. She led them through forgotten game trails and hidden canyons, circling back towards Harmony Creek from the east, the one direction no one would ever expect them to come from. The anger Ezekiel had felt at her manipulation slowly transformed into a focused, cold resolve. This was what he was good at: the planning, the scouting, the patient, deadly waiting. The war had hollowed him out, but it had also forged him into something sharp. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that was clearer than mere survival. Wade's power comes from two things, Ezekiel explained as they huddled behind a rock formation overlooking the valley where Harmony Creek lay spread out below them. Money and fear. We take those away, and his kingdom crumbles. The fear is easy to understand, Ayanna said, her eyes fixed on the town. He has a dozen men on his payroll who are little more than thugs, the ones who chased us. And the money? He owns the general store through a proxy. He owns the saloon. And he's been buying up every failed ranch and mining claim for pennies on the dollar, using his Apache raids to scare people off their land, she explained. The Murphy Ranch was just the latest acquisition. So he controls what people buy, where they drink, and who they're afraid of, Ezekiel mused. He's got the town in a stranglehold. We can't fight him head on. We have to be smarter. We have to turn the town against him. Their plan was simple in its concept, but terrifyingly dangerous in its execution. They needed proof. Hard proof that Wade was behind the raids, and they needed to get that proof in front of the townspeople without getting killed in the process. For 3 days they watched. They became shadows on the ridges, observing the rhythm of the town. They saw Wade's men, the deputies, ride out at night, not in a posse, but in small, quiet groups. They saw the nervous, frightened faces of the ordinary townsfolk. They saw the way Sheriff Wade walked his street, a king surveying his domain. There, Ayanna whispered one afternoon, pointing to a small, isolated cabin a mile outside of town. Smoke curled from its chimney. That's where Jebediah lives. He was the Murphys' closest friend. He's an old prospector, stubborn as a mule. He never believed the Apache story. He's been quiet since the raid, but he's not a man who frightens easily. He could be an ally, Ezekiel said, if he'll trust us. He won't trust you, Ayanna stated bluntly, but he might trust the truth. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they made their move. They crept down from the hills, moving through the darkness with a silence that was second nature to both of them. Leaving Ezekiel hidden in the trees, Ayanna approached the cabin alone. It was a calculated risk. A lone Chiricahua woman approaching a white man's cabin in the dead of night could easily end in a shotgun blast. Ezekiel watched, his heart pounding, his rifle ready. He saw a light flicker inside the cabin. He saw the door creak open. He saw Ayanna talking, her hands held out in a peaceful gesture. For what felt like an eternity, she stood on the doorstep, a silhouette against the lantern light. Then the old man stepped back and gestured for her to come inside. Phase 1 was complete. An hour later, Ayanna slipped back into the trees where Ezekiel was waiting. He knows, she said, her voice full of a new energy. Jebediah saw them. The night of the raid, he was checking his traps up on the ridge. He saw Wade's men, wearing buckskins and paint to look like Indians. He saw them ride down on the Murphy place. He's been terrified to speak up, afraid they'd come for him next. Did he see their faces? He saw one of them clearly in the moonlight. A man named Silas, Wade's right-hand man. The big one, with the beard you shot. Ezekiel's mind raced. It's his word against the sheriff's. Not enough to sway the whole town. Jebediah said Wade and Silas took something from the ranch, Ayanna continued. A lockbox. Old man Murphy kept his deed and all his savings in it. Jebediah thinks Wade has it hidden in his office. The sheriff's office. The most fortified building in town, with a deputy on guard at all hours. It was a fortress. If we can get that locked box, Ezekiel said, the plan forming in his head, we get the proof. The deed, signed over under duress, or maybe not signed at all, it would prove the motive for the murders. How do we get inside? We don't, Ezekiel said, a grim smile on his face. We make them bring it out. He explained his plan, a desperate gamble that relied on misdirection, timing, and pure, unadulterated nerve. Ayanna listened, her expression growing more and more incredulous. It's insane, she said when he finished. It's a soldier's plan, he replied. Create a diversion, strike the weak point, and get out before they know what hit them. And if it goes wrong, then we don't get out. The silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken risk. They were about to declare open war on Marcus Wade, and the first battle would be fought in the heart of his territory. There would be no retreat, no surrender. Jebediah has a few sticks of dynamite left over from his prospecting days, Ayanna said, her voice steady. Ezekiel looked at her, seeing the steel in her spine. Good, kid, he said. We're going to need them. The night of the plan was thick with tension. A storm was brewing in the mountains, the air heavy and electric. It was perfect. The diversion was Ezekiel's responsibility. He circled around to the north side of town, to the stables Wade owned. It was a large, dry-as-tinder structure, filled with hay. A single, well-placed lantern, accidentally knocked over, would create a fire big enough to draw every able-bodied man in town, including the deputies at the sheriff's office. Meanwhile, Ayanna, using the chaos as cover, would approach from the south. Her target was not the sheriff's office itself, but the telegraph office next door. Jebediah had told them that Wade, paranoid about his secrets, had run a wire from his office safe to the telegraph key. It was a primitive alarm system. If the safe was tampered with, it would send a signal. Ayanna's job was to cut that wire before the fire started. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, Jebediah. The old prospector, his courage reignited by their arrival, had agreed to the most dangerous job of all. Once the fire was raging and the telegraph wire was cut, he would use his dynamite not on the sheriff's office, but on the abandoned assay office at the opposite end of the street. The explosion would be the final piece of chaos, making it seem like a coordinated attack, drawing any remaining guards away from Wade's office. In that small window of absolute pandemonium, Ezekiel would hit the real target. He watched from the darkness as Ayanna, a fleeting shadow, slipped across the street and disappeared into the alley beside the telegraph office. He counted to 60, his heart hammering against his ribs. Then he moved. He entered the stable silently, the smell of hay and horses filling his senses. He found a lantern, lit it, and with a deep breath, tossed it into the largest pile of hay. The result was instantaneous. The dry hay erupted in a whoosh of flame. Within seconds, the entire structure was a blazing inferno. "Fire!" Ezekiel roared, his voice joining the crackle of the flames. "Fire at the stables!" He slipped back into the darkness as shouts erupted from the saloon. Doors flew open. Men poured into the street, their faces illuminated by the growing blaze. As predicted, the two deputies stationed at the sheriff's office joined the panicked bucket brigade running toward the fire. Then from the other end of town came a deafening roar. Boom! Jebediah's dynamite went off, sending a shock wave through the town. The windows of the assay office shattered, and a cloud of dust and debris billowed into the street. Panic turned to terror. It wasn't just a fire, it was an attack. This was his moment. Ezekiel sprinted across the now empty street, a crowbar in his hand. He slammed it into the lock of the sheriff's office. The wood splintered. The door flew open. He was inside. The office was dark, illuminated only by the flickering orange glow from the fire outside. He found the safe in the corner, a heavy black iron beast. It was locked, of course, but his target wasn't the safe itself. His target was Wade's paranoia. He knew a man like Wade, a man with so many secrets, wouldn't just hide his loot. He'd want it close. He'd want to be able to grab it and run if everything went south. Ezekiel ignored the safe and went straight for the floorboards beneath the sheriff's desk. He jammed the crowbar into a seam and pried. The board groaned, then splintered, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. And there it was. Not a lockbox. It was a leather satchel. He grabbed it just as he heard shouting from the street. They were realizing the office had been breached. Time was up. He burst out the back door of the office and sprinted for the darkness of the alley, the satchel clutched in his hand. He didn't look back. He met Ayanna at their rendezvous point, a rocky outcrop a quarter-mile from the chaos. She appeared from the shadows, her face grim. "Jebediah?" he asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's away clean. Headed for the hills," she confirmed. They didn't wait. They ran, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the burning, panicked town. They didn't stop until the glow of the fire was a faint smudge on the horizon, and the sounds of shouting were gone. In a sheltered ravine, by the light of a shielded candle, Ezekiel opened the satchel. It was all there. Deeds to half a dozen ranches, including the Murphy place, signed over with shaky, coerced signatures, bags of gold coin, and a ledger. A ledger written in Sheriff Wade's own hand, detailing every bribe, every land grab, every man he'd paid for, night rides. It was a complete confession of his entire criminal enterprise. But as Ezekiel flipped through the last few pages, he froze. His fingers went numb. The blood drained from his face. There at the bottom of a list of names under the heading, Payments for Information, was a name he recognized. A name that made no sense. A name that shattered everything. It was Ayanna. And next to her name was a date from 2 weeks ago, and the notation, $50, for the location of Ezekiel Thorne. The ledger lay open between them, the flickering candlelight making the ink seem to dance. Ayanna's name, a payment, for his location. The world tilted on its axis. The betrayal he had felt before was a pale shadow compared to this. It wasn't just that she had manipulated him. She had sold him. He was not her chosen weapon. He was her bait, bought and paid for. "Explain this," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He pushed the ledger across the dirt toward her. She looked down at it, her face unreadable in the shifting light. For a long moment she said nothing. The silence was a crushing weight. "It is what it looks like," she said finally, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. You work for him? Ezekiel's mind couldn't grasp it. You're one of his informants? This whole thing, your father? The revenge, was it all a lie? The story is true, she said, her eyes finally meeting his, and he saw no deception in them, only a profound, soul-deep weariness. He is my father. He did destroy my people. I do want my revenge. Then what is this? He demanded, jabbing a finger at her name in the book. It is how I survived, she whispered. After he abandoned us, my mother and I were outsiders. When the soldiers came and moved us to the reservation, the world became a cage. I learned that information was the only thing of value I possessed. I learned to listen, to watch. I fed scraps of information to men like Wade. Nothing that would truly hurt my people, but enough to earn a few dollars. Enough to buy food, medicine, enough to stay alive. She took a shaky breath. 2 months ago, I heard Wade talking. He was looking for a man, a former cavalry soldier, hiding out in the territory. A man with a price on his head from a powerful railroad baron whose payroll he'd supposedly stolen. A man named Ezekiel Thorne. The railroad payroll. A lie, of course. He'd never stolen a thing in his life. It was a frame-up, a story concocted by a man whose corruption he'd accidentally uncovered during his time as a scout. He'd been running from that bounty for the last year. Wade wanted the bounty, Ayanna continued. He put the word out. I knew this was my chance, my way to get close to him. So I took his money. I told him I would find you. And I did. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. She hadn't just tracked him. She had hunted him for her father, for the man she claimed to despise. So the plan was always to turn me over to him? Ezekiel asked, the words like stones in his throat. At first, yes, she admitted, her honesty brutal. That was the price of admission, the way to get into his inner circle, where I could finally find the proof I needed to destroy him. What changed? You did, she said, her voice soft but fierce. When you stood for me in that street, when you faced down Wade in his town, not for your own survival, but for me. No one has ever done that. In that moment, you stopped being a bounty, and you became my partner. I knew then that I could never give you to him. I knew we had to find another way. He stared at her, caught in a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a strange, unwilling understanding. Her life had been a desperate series of choices, each one harder than the last. To survive, she had been forced to deal with the devil himself. So the fire, the raid on his office. That was the other way, he said, thinking it through. Yes, to get the proof and to get you out from under his thumb. The ledger doesn't just condemn him, Ezekiel. It clears you. It lists the payments from the railroad baron to Wade, to hunt you down and kill you, to silence you permanently. It proves the bounty was a lie. She had played a long, dangerous game, with him as the primary pawn, and in the end, she had chosen him over her own lifelong plan for revenge. She had improvised, risking everything to save them both. The anger in him began to subside, replaced by a complex, turbulent sea of emotion. He looked at the ledger, at the proof of her betrayal and his salvation, all written in the same hand. Where does this leave us? He asked. It leaves us with a choice, she said. We have the proof. We can take this ledger and ride, disappear. We can be free, both of us. He could see the appeal in her eyes, the dream of California, the chance to finally stop running. But as he looked back in the direction of Harmony Creek, he thought of the people trapped there, the ones living under Wade's thumb, too afraid to fight back. He thought of Jebediah, the old man who had risked everything to help them. He thought of the Murphys, dead on their own land, and he knew they couldn't just run. No, he said, his voice firm. It's not enough to clear our names. It's not enough to just escape. A man like Wade, he'll just rebuild. He'll find other victims. The only way to end this is to cut the head off the snake. You still want to go back? She asked, a flicker of disbelief in her eyes. After this? More than ever, he said. He closed the ledger and tucked it securely into his saddlebag. He didn't just try to kill me. He tried to use you. He turned you into an informant against your own interests. He corrupted everything he touched. This isn't just your fight anymore, Ayana. It's mine, too. He looked at her, his partner in this insane, desperate war. The lies between them had been burned away, leaving only a hard, dangerous truth. They were both damaged, both compromised, two people forged in the fires of a brutal world, and they were going to burn that world down. We have the proof, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. Now we just need a jury. The people of Harmony Creek are not a jury, Ayana argued. They are sheep, and Wade is the wolf. Then we give the sheep teeth. They returned not to the town, but to the hills surrounding it. With Jebediah as their go-between, they began a silent, invisible campaign. Jebediah, now a ghost in his own valley, would slip into town at night, a whisperer in the dark. He would go to the people he knew he could trust, the ones who had also been squeezed by Wade, the ones who had lost land or family. He wouldn't show them the ledger. That was their ace in the hole. He would just plant seeds of doubt. Did you ever wonder why the Apache only ever attack folks who won't sell to the sheriff? He'd ask one man over a hidden jug of moonshine. Funny how Wade's men always show up just after the trouble, never during. He'd mentioned to a blacksmith whose supply costs from Wade's general store were crippling him. Slowly, carefully, they began to turn the tide. It was a war of whispers, of quiet conversations in dark corners. Fear began to give way to suspicion. Suspicion began to curdle into anger. Meanwhile, Ezekiel and Ayana waged a different kind of war. They became nuisances, ghosts haunting Wade's operations. A shipment of whiskey for his saloon would be found, with the barrels smashed open at the bottom of a ravine. A fence on a newly acquired property would be cut, the cattle scattered to the four winds. A bridge on the main supply road would be sabotaged, just enough to be impassable for a week. They never showed themselves. They never fired a shot. They were just a constant, frustrating pressure. Wade grew more and more agitated, his temper fraying. He started making mistakes, pushing his men harder, lashing out at the townspeople for not finding the outlaws. The more he squeezed, the more the town began to slip through his fingers. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Wade, furious and paranoid, decided to make an example. He dragged a poor farmer who had been overheard questioning the official story of the Murphy raid into the middle of the street. He accused the man of aiding fugitives. He was going to hang him, right there in front of the whole town as a warning. This was the moment Ezekiel and Ayana had been waiting for. This was the public stage they needed. As Wade's men threw a rope over the crossbeam of a half-built structure, and the terrified farmer was forced to stand on a horse, Ezekiel and Ayana made their entrance. They didn't ride in with guns blazing. They walked, side by side, down the middle of the main street, completely unarmed. A gasp went through the crowd. People scrambled out of the way. Wade and his men spun around, their faces a mask of shock and fury. "Thorne!" Wade roared, his hand dropping to his pistol. "You've got a hell of a nerve showing your face here." "We're not here for a fight, Wade," Ezekiel called out, his voice calm and caring. He held up his empty hands. "We're here to talk, to the people of Harmony Creek." Wade laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "They've got nothing to say to you." "I think they do," Ayana said, her voice clear and strong. She stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the crowd. "I think they want to know who really killed the Murphy family." "It was the Apache," one of Wade's men shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. The seeds of doubt had taken root. "Was it?" Ezekiel asked, his eyes locking with Wade's. "Or was it the men who stood to gain from their deaths? The man who now holds the deed to their land?" A murmur went through the crowd. This was what Jebediah had been whispering about. "That's a lie," Wade snarled, his face turning purple. "Is it?" Ezekiel reached into his coat and pulled out the ledger. He held it up for everyone to see. "Then I guess this is a book of lies, too. A ledger. In your own handwriting, Wade, detailing every dollar you've paid for murder, every life you've destroyed to build your little empire." The crowd surged forward, craning their necks to see. The atmosphere in the street had changed from fear to a tense, hungry curiosity. "Silas!" Wade screamed at his bearded deputy. "Shoot them! Shoot them now!" But Silas, the man Jebediah had identified at the raid, hesitated. His eyes were wide, fixed on the ledger in Ezekiel's hand. He knew what was in that book. His own name was probably in it. He looked at the angry, suspicious faces of the townspeople, the people he lived with, and then back at his boss. For the first time, he saw Wade not as a powerful leader, but as a cornered animal. And then something incredible happened. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Gunner, stepped forward from the crowd. He was holding a heavy hammer. He didn't say a word. He just stood there between Ezekiel and the deputies. Then another man stepped forward, and another. Jebediah appeared from the crowd, an old shotgun in his hands. Within seconds, a dozen armed and angry citizens had formed a human wall, protecting Ezekiel and Ayanna. The sheep had found their teeth. Wade looked at the faces of the people he had terrorized for so long, and he saw no fear. He saw only judgment. His power, built on shadows and lies, evaporated in the harsh light of the truth. He did the only thing a coward could do. He ran. He shoved his own deputy aside, scrambling for his horse. But Ayanna was faster. She moved like a striking snake, tackling him at the knees, bringing him down in a cloud of dust. She wrenched the pistol from his hand and stood over him, her face a mask of cold fury. It was over. The aftermath was messy. Wade and his men were locked in their own jail cells. A rider was sent to the territorial capital with the ledger and a dozen signed witness statements. The law, the real law, was finally coming to Harmony Creek. Ezekiel and Ayanna stood on the same ridge where they had once planned the town's downfall, looking down at the valley. The air felt cleaner, lighter. "What will you do now?" Ezekiel asked. "Jebediah and some of the others want me to stay," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice. "They say this is my home as much as anyone's." The idea seemed both foreign and wonderful to her. A woman who had belonged to no one was finally being claimed by a community. "And you?" she asked, turning to him. "California? The dream of freedom?" Ezekiel thought about it. He could ride away. His name was cleared. He had a whole continent in front of him, a lifetime of wandering he could still do. But when he looked at Ayanna, at the strong, brilliant, complicated woman who had both betrayed him and saved him, he knew his wandering days were over. He hadn't been looking for a place to stop. He'd been looking for a person. "I reckon I've seen enough of the scenic route," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I think I'd like to see what it's like to stay put for a while." Her answering smile was all the promise of a sunrise he would ever need. They had both come to this desert looking for something different. He for a reason, she for revenge. But in the dust and blood and lies, they had found something else entirely. They had found each other. And for two people who had always been alone, that was a better treasure than all the gold in California. The story of Ezekiel and Ayanna is a testament to the fact that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into, and that true justice isn't about revenge. It's about building something better in the place of what was broken. What would you have done in Ezekiel's place? Could you have ever trusted Ayanna again after discovering her secret? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of the Old West, and you want more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and it ensures you won't miss our next adventure. Thanks for stopping by, and be careful out there. You never know who you might meet in the desert.